Hello and welcome back. This is the week 7 lecture. So today we talk about paraphrasing and quoting. Much like summarizing, these are essential skills that you'll need to master and later use on our big research papers at the end of the semester. So we're going to be practicing these skills over the next few weeks. We covered summarizing last week, and I think most of us are pretty comfortable with it, but you might have noticed in my instructions on the big summary assignment that was due at the end of last week, I did mention paraphrasing and quoting. That was actually a mistake on my part. I meant to take those out. What I showed you guys was an older version of that big summary assignment. It's not a big deal, but I've kind of changed the way I do the summary in recent semesters. Previously, I would have students practice summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting, but now I like to just stick to summarizing at first, and then after the summary, we work on paraphrasing and quoting in preparation for the rhetorical analysis, which is our next major assignment due in a few weeks. So on that rhetorical analysis, you'll have a chance to show me your summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting abilities. But if you saw my original instructions for the summary and you went ahead and tried to paraphrase and quote, that's fine, no big deal. But here, this week, we're going to actually start to learn how to do those things the right way, and I'll start to evaluate you and your ability to do these things in the weeks to come. So let's start with the paraphrase, because it really is the cousin of the summary. And we've been summarizing a lot in this class. So just like a summary, a paraphrase is a restatement of a text's main ideas in your own words. But what makes a paraphrase and a summary different will often be length. So we talked about how a summary is a condensed version of the original source material that you are working with. You are shortening it. You're shrinking it down. You're only hitting the highlights. You're only mentioning the most important ideas, the biggest points, and obviously the overall argument of the source. But see, a paraphrase is different. A paraphrase is not condensed. It is not shorter. In fact, the paraphrase that you write will be roughly the same length as the original. And it should contain all of the same points, all of the same ideas as the original. So you're going to hear sometimes people using the terms summary and paraphrase kind of interchangeably, as if they mean the same thing, but they really don't. They are related, they are similar, but they're not the exact same, because a paraphrase will be approximately the same length as the original source material. But they are similar, the summary and paraphrase are similar in that they will both be in your own words. They are both a process of you taking the ideas, taking the big points from your source and translating them into your own words, your own language, your own sentences. And you might be doing that in order to make those ideas easier to understand for your audience. I hope you guys are noticing with at least some of your sources that they can be a little bit difficult to read at times, especially if you are looking at peer-reviewed scholarly articles from academic journals. A lot of these articles are tackling really difficult, complex subject matter. They can often be very dense, very difficult to read. So if you're going to use some of that stuff to support your own points in your own paper or to explain certain things to your readers, you need to explain those ideas. That stuff that you're taking from the source, you need to put it in your own words, using your own vocabulary, using a sentence structure that is comfortable for you. And that's going to make that original source material more accessible. It's going to make it easier to understand both for you and for your readers. So that's why these are important skills to develop. So When you come across a really good passage, a really good section of your source, whether you're reading an article from a magazine, an academic journal, maybe a book or a book chapter, even something good on a website, typically you're going to come across a sentence or maybe two sentences or maybe a short paragraph that you really, really like. There's some important ideas there. There's some really big points that are helping to express maybe the overall argument of the source, or they're just doing some kind of important work. There might be some really compelling evidence there. You come across this kind of passage often as a researcher if you're doing good research. So you'll come across these passages and think to yourself, oh, I want to use this. This is really good. I want to get some of this into my own paper. Well, paraphrasing and quoting are sort of your best two options when you find a passage that you really like. If you don't feel like you can express those ideas any better than the author, then that's a good time to quote. If the language is really punchy, memorable, catchy, or just really powerful in some way, that might be a good sentence to quote. Even a couple of sentences. You might want to directly quote those because they just sound so good. They sound better than anything you could come up with. But if you feel the opposite, if you feel like, oh, it's good stuff, but I feel like I could express it more clearly, or I can make the language simpler and easier to understand. When you're looking at a passage like that, especially if it's about a scientific topic, maybe something connected to the medical profession, stuff with specialized language, it's complex, it's difficult to understand, that's a good candidate for a paraphrase, because you want to capture the essence, you want to capture the ideas, you want to capture the points that the author is making, but you think your language might work a little bit better than the author's language. That's when you want to paraphrase. So you need to exercise good choice. You need to make good decisions when you find these kinds of passages. Decide if they're good candidates to be quoted or if they should be paraphrased. Because like I said, when you're trying to present stuff to the audience, a lot of times it's, you've already worked through your sources. You've already explained the difficult concepts to yourself. You've already looked up some definitions, hopefully. This is the kind of work that you do when you're annotating, when you're underlining, when you're asking questions. You've already kind of worked through your sources. You understand them. You understand what the authors are saying. But when you're presenting some of that stuff to your audience, you have to keep in mind that we are not as familiar with your sources as you are. And we might not understand those specialized terms. We might not understand some of that language. So that's when you want to translate it into your own words, a more common vocabulary, a simpler sentence structure for the benefit of your readers. So that's generally how we kind of decide if we want to paraphrase or quote. And if you want to look at what a paraphrase kind of, looks like, take a look at the example that I posted in the week 7 module. It's just a PDF. I took this from an old textbook, but you should see 2 columns of text. One comes from the original source document, and then we have the student's paraphrase of that original source. So you'll notice that the original text is a little bit difficult to read and understand. It's kind of complex. The author, that original author, isn't necessarily explaining everything. But then if we look over at the student's paraphrase, we'll notice that the student is taking those same ideas and just putting them in easier to understand terms, easier language, writing new sentences that are a little bit more clear, a little bit easier to follow than the original source document. He's not, the student is not changing anything. He's not adding anything. Remember, just like the summary, we don't add our opinions. We don't add our own sort of feelings. We're not inserting ourselves yet when we summarize or paraphrase. But with a paraphrase, we're also not taking anything out. With the summary, we have to leave a lot out. With the paraphrase, we are trying to faithfully reproduce that original source text just in our own words. So you'll notice in the process of doing that, the student in that second column actually ends up writing a little bit more. His paraphrase actually ends up being a little bit longer than the original source passage. But that's fine. It's not a lot longer. It's like maybe one additional sentence, maybe like one or two additional lines. But the reason that happens is because the student is trying to kind of explain some of these ideas, some of these sophisticated concepts that we find in the original passage. So that takes some slightly more words. That takes the student a little bit more time, a little bit more space to explain that stuff, to put it in more common language, and that's fine. As long as the length of your paraphrase is close to the original length of that source text that you're working with. So, last week we were summarizing entire sources. When we paraphrase, we want to tackle smaller sections. We want to tackle these specific passages. So it might be a particular sentence, it might be a couple of sentences, it might even be a short paragraph, like 3 to 4 sentences. Those would all be good candidates for paraphrasing. But obviously, you don't want to paraphrase an entire article, because what you end up with will be the same length, roughly, as that original article, and we don't want to do that much. So tackle a paragraph, tackle some really good sentences. Those are the things that you will typically be paraphrasing. All right, so if you want to go the other way, and you want to use a direct quote because you feel like the author is just saying this so well, it's so powerful, it's so memorable, I can't say it any better in a summary or a paraphrase, so I'm just going to use the author's words. That's fine. That's actually an effective strategy if we do it correctly and if we don't do it too much. So providing direct quotes can be a very effective rhetorical strategy, just meaning it can help to make your argument more effective. But we need to do quotes the right way, because a lot of students will try to incorporate direct quotes, but they might not get it quite right. They might not always use the best quotes. They often use too many quotes, and that can backfire. So if you'll remember, when we were talking about different types of evidence, we mentioned as one of our inartistic appeals, we talked about testimonials, the words of others. And we talked about both expert opinion. There's really two kinds of testimonial. Expert opinion and like eyewitness accounts or firsthand experiences of people who have direct, experience with the topic or whatever it is that's being written about. So we like testimonials. That is one of our types of inartistic appeals. It's a very effective type of evidence, but we don't want to overuse it, and we don't want to use it in inappropriate ways. So let's talk about what the direct quote is, what it should look like, how we should format it, because these are all important things. Now, we like quoting. I don't have to really encourage you guys to quote. Typically, students want to quote. Students are eager to provide direct quotations, but I don't know if the motivations are always the best. Often, we like to quote because direct quotations take up space, and they are somebody else's words, not our own. So we might think of it as a way for us to write less, to do a little bit less, but I also understand the instinct to want to bring in especially expert opinion. Hey, these guys are doctors, these women are scientists, they are professors, they are experts, they know more than me. So of course I want to use them, and you should use them. But we need to make sure that we're quoting the right way. And what a lot of students do is what a lot of composition instructors will refer to as dropping quote bombs. And that might sound fun, but it's actually not good. It's a negative thing. So a quote bomb is when a student just sort of drops a direct quote into whatever paper they're writing. They just drop it in there with no introduction, No explanation, no real rhyme or reason. They're not making it clear why they're using the quote. They don't really directly address the quote. They don't even really talk about it themselves. They just drop it in after one of their sentences, and then they pick back up with their next sentence, and they might not even acknowledge the quote. So this is a very strange, sort of disorienting experience as a reader. Any of your readers would experience some confusion at a quote bomb. What's that quote doing here? Is that quote like that? Clearly, the author, the whoever put the quote there, they meant for it to matter, to mean something, but your readers are scrambling to understand why you used it. Why did you use it right there? It might not be clear. And even if it is, even if the quote does obviously relate to whatever you're talking about in that particular paragraph, without an introduction and without a true explanation, it's still not very effective, because you're, at the very minimum, you're making your reader make connections that you need to make for the reader. You don't want to make your reader's life more difficult. So if the reader has to pause even just for a moment and be like, wait, does this quote is supporting the, oh, okay, this quote comes from, oh, all right, now, okay, I see. They might be able to figure it out, but don't make them. Introduce your quote, explain your quote, and obviously you need to correctly cite your quote using an in-text citation. If you don't do all of those things, the quote is not going to work very well. You're going to end up with a quote bomb that might do more harm than good. So what we want to practice this week and moving into next week is a concept that's very simple, very helpful, very useful, called the quote sandwich. I don't know if any of you have heard of this before. I learned about this early in school, but it actually got taught in college as well. It's something for kids, but it's also for adults. It's helpful no matter what grade level you are, what age you are. It's just an easy way to do direct quotes. And starting around high school, maybe even middle school, we're kind of expected to be able to quote, and that will continue in more advanced types of writing. So the quote sandwich is just an easy way to do it. It's an easy structure that always works. And if you can just think about what a sandwich is and what a sandwich consists of, you'll be able to understand how to do good direct quotes. So think about a sandwich, any kind of sandwich. We're going to have three central components. If it's a traditional sandwich, right? We're going to have 2 slices of bread, and then we're going to have something inside the sandwich. Maybe multiple things, but we're going to at least have one thing. Some kind of meat, maybe cheese. It might be peanut butter and jelly. It could be any number of things. But just at the most simple, basic level, we can identify 3 elements of the sandwich. The top slice of bread, the meat, or whatever it is that's inside the sandwich, we're just going to treat that as one thing, and then the bottom slice of bread. That's pretty simple. That's how we need to think about direct quotes too. So for us, the direct quote, whether it be a complete sentence, maybe even just a phrase. You don't always have to quote complete sentences. You might just have a phrase, a handful of words, maybe one complete sentence, maybe even 2 complete sentences. No matter what, the quote itself is going to be the meat of your sandwich. And then the top slice of bread, that's going to be the top slice of bread. Okay? I'm sorry, I think I got confused there. The top slice of bread is going to be the introduction to the quote. Okay? That's how you need to think about the top slice. You need to acquaint us with this quote. You need to familiarize your readers with this quote. So you are literally introducing the quote to your readers. An easy way to do this might be to identify the author who is talking here. Whatever expert, whatever expert you're using, or if it's a journalist or an eyewitness, whatever, who is talking. Generally, this is going to be the author of the source. who's talking. You can identify the author, and you can just get us ready for the source. Often the introduction will be very brief. It might just be a short phrase at the beginning of this sentence that you're writing. It can be a brief phrase. It can even be a complete sentence, but it's usually not going to be very long. You can introduce the quote with one phrase or one sentence, and then we get to the quote itself. All right, so we have the top slice of bread, then the quote, and then we have the bottom slice of bread, which is the explanation or the follow-up that you provide after the quote. Now, some quotes might be pretty self-explanatory. They might be pretty obvious in terms of their meaning and their significance. So you might not always feel like you have to explain the quote, but sometimes you will. Sometimes the quote is not going to be immediately obvious to your readers. So you might need to provide a little bit more info. You might need to do a little bit more of that translation work. In other words, what the author is saying here is blank. And once again, you're using your own words to clarify some of the author's ideas or points. So sometimes you will be explaining the quote because it demands some kind of explanation. But in other cases, if you don't have to explain it, that's fine, but you still need to do something with it. You still need to follow up on it. You need to use it to make your next move. What's the next point that you're going to make? What's the next type of evidence that you're going to bring in? Use this source as a transition or a springboard to the next thing that you're going to do. Use this quote as, a way to do the next thing. Build something on top of this quote. Use this quote to move forward in your argument, in your paper. Otherwise, like I was saying earlier, the readers are going to wonder, what's this quote doing here other than just taking up space? You need to make it clear why this quote matters, why it's important. Again, sometimes instead of explaining the quote, you're just explaining why it matters to your argument or how it supports your own claims, your own ideas. And that's a fine thing to do as that bottom slice of bread. So the bottom slice of bread of our quote sandwich, and that is what we're describing here, the quote sandwich, the bottom slice of bread will be a standalone sentence that comes after the quote. So if you guys look in the week 7 overview, I've sort of shown you what a quote should look like. So that top slice of bread and the quote will usually go together in the same sentence. Okay? Because like I said, you're introducing the quote usually in a very brief way with just a short phrase, or it might be something that could stand alone as a complete sentence, but you're tacking something on after it, which is, of course, the quote. So you have that first sentence with the top slice of bread and the quote. After the quote, you need an in-text citation, as we probably know. And then after that in-text citation, which will come inside parentheses, we also call them parenthetical citations for that reason. After the parentheses, we put a period and we end that first sentence. And then we start our next sentence with the bottom slice of bread. Doing something with that quote, explaining it, talking about its importance, following up on it in some way. And then that gets us on to the next thing. That's the cleanest, easiest way to format our quote sandwiches. And just one more thing to keep in mind, punctuation does matter. So there's really two types of direct quotes. You don't have to memorize these, but you might just want to keep a general impression of this in mind. The first type is called separated quotes. And that means we have our introduction, the beginning of our sentence, and then we have the quote, but that quote is separated from the first part of our sentence by punctuation, either a comma or a colon. So pretty easy to understand. That punctuation separates the quote from what came earlier in the sentence. Okay? That's all a separated quote means. But we also have a thing called integrated quotes. And you can probably figure out what that means. That means the quote is seamlessly incorporated into your own sentence. That's all integration is, right? The quote exists very harmoniously and organically in your own sentence. It's not separated from the beginning of your sentence by any punctuation. So the easiest way to do an integrated quote is to start with your top slice of bread, and that little introduction should end with like the word that. As we see here, Dr. Lackey says that, and now you can go directly into your quote without any need for punctuation. A word like that allows you to create an integrated quotation where you don't actually need punctuation. So there's actually some other words that you could use, like to or in or by. These are the kinds of words that will help you create an integrated quotation where your quote just follows naturally right after one of those words. That, by, in, or to. So a lot of times when you're doing this, it's fine if what you're quoting isn't necessarily a complete sentence. If it's just a phrase, if it's just a part of a longer sentence, it might actually be pretty easy to integrate it into your own sentence. But if you still want to tackle a complete sentence, that's fine. Just make sure your introduction, that top slice of bread, leads naturally right into the start of the sentence that you're quoting. So that seamless integrated style of quoting does not require punctuation. But if you do want to have a separated quote, if you want to have an introduction, then punctuation, followed by the quote, you have two options. And people typically do separated quotations more often just because they're a little bit easier to do. So you can use a short introductory phrase at the beginning of your sentence. And I posted a list of templates, a bunch of examples that you guys can look at. And you just replace the X in these samples with your own author's names. So again, we're often going to identify the author of our source when we are quoting that person. So X states, comma, then the quote. And of course, we know the quote will be in quotation marks. We've already learned that, but don't forget that and don't overlook that or neglect it. Because if you forget to put quotes in quotation marks, that is, of course, plagiarism, even if it's accidental. So we always use those quotation marks to show that somebody else is speaking. So you see my examples. X states that takes away the need for the comma, like I've already said. So you can see some of these basic templates. According to X, X agrees when she writes blank. X, in her book, X says blank. So these are easy introductory phrases that you can use. And for most of these examples, we have a phrase, a brief introductory phrase, followed by a comma, and then we start the quote, illustrated by those quote marks. Now, if we want to use a slightly bigger, more detailed introduction to the quote, we might want to use what could stand as a complete sentence. Look at my final two examples in the document I posted. X makes a strong counterpoint near the end of his essay. That could be a complete sentence, as could the one right below it. But instead, I'm going to use these independent clauses as my introduction to the quote. So when I'm using an introduction, that could be a complete sentence because it has a subject, it has a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. But I want to use that as my top slice of bread. Instead of using a comma to separate it from the quote, I use a semicolon. I'm sorry, I'm wrong. You use a colon, a full colon, like you see in my examples. A full colon, the two dots, okay? Because now you have a complete what could be a complete sentence. That means an independent clause. It has a subject. It has a verb. It expresses a complete thought. You need more than just a comma to separate that intro from the quote. You need a stronger punctuation sign. Now, a semicolon is stronger, but a colon is even stronger. So you need the full colon if you want to introduce the quote with what could be a complete sentence. Okay, so again, look at my examples. For the short phrases, you just need a comma. For what could be complete sentences, you need a colon. Just commit that to memory. And remember the difference between a semicolon and a colon. They're not the same thing. We don't want semicolons here. Okay, for phrases, we want commas. For what could be complete sentences, we want colons. All right, that's if you're going to do a separated quote. If you want to integrate the quote directly into your own sentence, again, look at some of my examples of that. Use words like that, by, or in to achieve a more seamless integration. It might be fun to try that at least once or twice, but it can prove challenging. So feel free to just stick with the separated model where we have the intro to the quote followed by a comma or a colon, then the quote in quotation marks, and then after you have that quote, don't forget about the next step, which is, of course, the in-text citation. So I'm showing you guys some examples of what in-text citations look like. Hopefully, you had to use some of these in 101. They're usually pretty simple depending on what kind of source you're using. So if you're quoting something from an article or a book chapter and you have an author and a page number, that's all you need. Look at my examples. Lackey 45. Last name of author, and you need last name only. Last name of author followed by page number. That's what comes inside the parentheses, and then the period ending that sentence comes after the parentheses. Then we start the next sentence with our bottom slice of bread, that follow-up to the quote. So there will be some situations where your in-text citations might look a little different. Some sources don't have an author, so that's okay. If you don't have an author, you can use an abbreviated version of the article title in place of the author. So you don't want more than 4 words typically, so just take the first 3 or 4 words of the title. If it's longer than that, just take the first 3 or 4 words. Article titles, as we know, go in quotation marks as well. And then if you still have a page number, include the page number. For some sources, we don't have page numbers. So if you don't, that's fine. You don't have to include them. But you always have to include an in-text citation after a direct quote. And eventually, we need to provide in-text citations when we summarize and when we paraphrase as well. So look at my examples. Look at my quote sandwiches. You can pay attention to the top slice of bread, the punctuation, the in-text citation, and also check out the bottom slices of bread. Ways to start our explanation or our follow-up to the quote. But you'll notice that all of my samples of bottom slices are ways to start a new sentence after the quote. Okay, that's the cleanest way to do this. So this takes a little bit of practice. Don't expect to be a pro at quoting right away. You need to practice. I encourage you guys to grab one of your sources at some point this week and just find something to quote and just practice writing a few quote sandwiches. You kind of need to get comfortable with the format. And you can always use your own top slices of bread and your own bottom slices. You don't have to use my samples in that document I posted in the week 7 module. I'm just giving you examples to help you understand the concept. But you don't have to use mine. You can use your own. But just remember to follow the punctuation rules and never drop a quote in like a bomb. Always introduce it and always follow up on it. Remember the top and bottom slices of bread. Okay, so we'll come back next week and get started on the rhetorical analysis, where we're going to be using all these skills that we've been working with. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.